From WNPR, I'm John Dankosky, and this is The Wheelhouse.
Smoke fills the air, neighborhood after neighborhood evacuated as these fires rage. Here in Santa Rosa, the fire, 0% containment.
News follows the damning report in the New York Times detailing numerous sexual harassment allegations against Weinstein.
But while the Secretary of State disputed the gist of NBC's reporting, he did not deny having called the president a moron.
We are the highest corporate taxed country in the developed economies across the globe.
Sarah, so that's accurate, but the president keeps repeating this claim that we're the highest tax nation.
And that's what we are, the highest tax corporate nation.
That's not what he said. He said we're the highest tax nation in the world.
The highest tax corporate nation. It seems pretty consistent to me.
Tennessee Republican Bob Corker turning to the New York Times to air his concerns about the president, saying Trump's Twitter threats toward other nations could put America on the path to World War III.
Oh, boy. You can join the conversation, 860-275-7266. Comment on our website, WNPR.org/The Wheelhouse. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. Joining us today, as always, is Colin McEnroe. He's the host of the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. Howdy, Colin.
Good morning, Mr. Dankosky.
Keith Phaneuf is our budget guru. He covers the budget for the Connecticut Mirror, and we turn to him for all things having to do with the budget, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Keith, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And Suzanne Bates is here, policy director at the Yankee Institute for Public Policy. Hello there once again, Suzanne.
Good morning.
So we are going to zoom in on the Connecticut state budget and where we are right now at the Capitol, but let's turn to the Capitol in Washington. The latest feud for President Trump is with Bob Corker. He's a Republican, a former supporter of the president. They've gotten into another one of these little tit-for-tats that turns up on Twitter. Name-calling is involved. The thing that seems interesting here, Colin, is that as the president has been unable to get reform of health care passed, in part because he doesn't have quite enough Republican senators on his side, making enemies with yet another Republican senator probably doesn't seem like the best tactical move right now.
Got a 52-seat majority in the Senate. Rand Paul is probably not going to go down the road with tax and budget reform as it's currently understood. So, I mean, the Republicans are in sort of an odd position because, in a way, yes, Donald Trump has created a basis for defection. But defection from what? Defection from Donald Trump or defection from Republican cohesion? Because the other problem that Republicans have is as they head towards a midterm election year, they need to do something. At least that's the conventional wisdom. I'm not entirely sure I agree with that convention. The conventional wisdom, they need to do something. They haven't really done anything of any note in this session, that they have had this command of government now in terms of a president, both chambers of Congress. What do they have to show for it? I'm actually not as convinced as a lot of people are that the American public just needs to see them do something, and it would probably be a mistake for them to do something highly unappetizing to vast swatches of the American public just to prove that they can do it. But anyway, yes, having a feud with Bob Corker, probably not a really good idea. But Bob Corker's loyalties are probably first and foremost to the Senate, to the Republican majority in the Senate. Anyway, I think that Rand Paul and McCain are the two jumpy people right now on this budget thing. I don't know what role Corker. I think Corker has a different role to play.
Okay, but just very quickly, if Corker has a different role to play, I'm wondering, given the strong words that he has used, that other Republicans have used, including McCain in the past, the fact that more and more people who believe in, for whatever reason, the sort of sanctity of the Senate or sanctity of a different type of Republican Party than Donald Trump has tried to turn it into. Why is it that there's not more movement toward people actually pushing back against the Trump agenda or against President Trump outside of just a Twitter war back and forth or quotes in the New York Times?
Well, I think that's the big question. And to me, I mean, if you peel back all the really juvenile stuff about Corker's height and people's IQs and, I mean, all this crazy stuff that's been going on this week, the thing that you have that's really at the nut of Corker's criticism is he has now been saying that he considers Trump essentially unfit for office, that he's dangerous, he might get us into World War III, that it is a daily struggle for the White House staff, for Kelly et al. Every day they have to find some way to rein this guy in. He's that dangerous. Now, I do think at some point your actions have to match your words a little bit. If Bob Corker really really believes that, then he needs to do some pretty serious. I mean, you can't say something like that the President of the United States is a dangerous man who may very well get us into World War III and then never do anything about it. He has some options. I mean, the history lesson here is that at certain times Congress has, on a bipartisan basis, particularly during the time of Andrew Johnson, worked together to essentially create government by Congress. There's things you can do. There's actually a bill that's been raised, for example. I don't necessarily say it's a good bill, but there's a bill that's been raised that would require congressional approval for the president to launch a nuclear assault. It actually exists. It's in Congress right now. Maybe that's not the right thing. Maybe Corker needs to really be meeting very quietly, and maybe he is, with Rex Tillerson and John Kelly and whoever else is in the business of trying to figure out a way to get through all this without nuclear incineration.
The difference between Senator Corker and a lot of his Republican colleagues is that he's already said he's not running again. And so he's free in a way that most of them are not, because the tricky thing that I think a lot of Republicans face is how to criticize Trump without feeling like you're also criticizing the vast swath of people who support him. And, you know, a lot of people respect those voters but don't necessarily respect Donald Trump. And so I think that is, you know, the tricky path for a lot of those Republicans. I mean, you look at Senator Jeff Flake, who's running for re-election, who's been critical of Trump and now faces a very stiff primary competition. And so, you know, I think that's the concern.
To me, the question that always pops out is, though, can you, if you're in Congress, can you criticize President Trump? Because, I mean, everybody knew he was coming from a different background. This is not somebody who still gets the idea that you build relationships to get things through. But everything seems to devolve for him into, as far as his dynamic with Congress, it's a parallel to a chairman of the board meeting with not just senior management, but incompetent senior management. And as long as everything goes, if he's talking about doing something like tax reform, which I'm sorry, we really haven't had like anything that's really moved the needle one way or the other since President Reagan. I mean, the tax cuts under George W. Bush were nowhere near in scope what happened. I mean, he's talking about trying to do something that hasn't been done in 3 decades. It's not going to happen in a dynamic like this, not with any Congress.
Right, well, and you've also got some divergence in the two houses, the two chambers. The House has a little bit more of a Suzanne Bates approach. The Senate has a plan that does actually add to the deficit. The House wants to be deficit neutral. I think that's fair to say that's a Suzanne Bates approach.
Thank you.
So, I mean, you don't right now have reconciliation between the majorities in the two chambers. You also, within these majorities in each chamber, have a certain amount of strife. The House, Ryan seems to be able to hold his people together. As we know, McConnell's got people just flying off in all directions. We know that from the healthcare debate. So the notion that they can pass this thing, and the other quick, I know we're pressed for time here, but the other quick thing I want to say is if I were a Republican senator heading out to campaign in 2018, I'd be very nervous about a set of tax cuts which are pretty easily discreditable in terms of the way that they favor the wealthy. I mean, Trump having run on middle class renaissance, his package doesn't really kind of support that thing.
Well, and I think, Suzanne, that part of it is it's this question of what Republicans are going to run against. They want to maybe run against Donald Trump, but not against all of his voters. But that split that we just talked about in the House and the Senate, that shows up in the split in the Republican Party. I mean, there's people who want to make sure, like Rand Paul, I mean, we want to get at the major deficits that we have. We don't want to tax people more, but we also don't want to do some of the things that are in this tax package as well. I mean, looking at what's in the Trump tax package right now, it seems quite clear that there's going to have to be something, borrowing or some sort of revenue enhancements to pay for some of the things that he wants to do. It's like the party's all over the place on this, and they need to cohere around an idea, if not a leader like Trump.
Sure. I mean, I think you have some deficit hawks in the party, and it's going to be hard for them to vote for any package that raises the debt. And so I think that, but I have to tell you, there's a ton of energy on the conservative side. I mean, just across the board that I see on changing the tax code. So I think we will see something.
But what does it look like? I mean, what does that change look like? And does it line up with what we're hearing right now from the administration and what they're trying to put forward?
I mean, yeah, I think a lot of it lines up. I mean, yes, of course, it's always easier to sort of be that, make a list of things you'd like to do, and then it's much harder to govern, right? I mean, it's hard. They're going to have to come together and compromise on things. But I think there's a lot of energy there, especially behind some of the, the corporate tax cuts, simplifying the tax code on the personal income tax side. And yes, the Democrats will say you're lowering taxes on the rich. Well, the rich pay the majority of taxes, so they almost always have a disproportionate share of the breaks. But getting rid of something like the state and local tax deduction, which would hurt Connecticut, but it's actually probably good policy, right? Because that actually benefits wealthy people more so than people who just take the standard deduction. So there are things in that package that I think even progressives could get behind if they could get over the fact that they were supporting something that was aligned with Trump.
Keith, since we're going to be talking about taxes likely coming in this next Connecticut state budget, and what do you see in this Trump tax plan? What do you see as some of the implications here?
Yeah, I think the problem is twofold. One, Colin already hit one of the points, the middle class renaissance. They're going to have a tough time doing some of the things that Suzanne just talked about and not, I won't say incur the wrath, but it's more than tweak a significant part of Trump's base. And that's going to be one issue. The other thing is how much benefit Connecticut gets out of it. Don't forget, there will still have to be some balancing moves on the expenditure side. And that's where a blue state like Connecticut, particularly in areas like Medicaid, is probably going to pay. So the tax breaks may giveth and taketh as far as Connecticut's concerned.
Go ahead, Colin.
I just want to, as Suzanne talked about simplification. Simplification can be kind of a complicated code word. So, one of the things that is being proposed is getting rid of the alternative minimum tax. The alternative minimum tax, by the way, is the thing that actually got the federal government to get Donald Trump to pay some taxes in 2005. This is one of the things where, basically what alternative minimum tax is, after all the loopholes that your tax account has been able to find, you still have to pay this amount of money. You can't get below this amount of money. You still have to pay it. There's also stuff like the pass-through provision, which very quickly, the next time you sign your $800,000 contract with Connecticut Public Broadcasting, what you would do under this proposal is you would not have it paid to John Dankosky. You would have it paid to JD Broadcasting LLC, where it would be taxed at a lower rate and then passed along to you.
I'm taking down notes, even as we speak.
I handle all your negotiations here. I don't know how many people know that.
But just very quickly, what's interesting, too, is so now we see if the president is making enemies in his own party where he needs support in the Senate to pass any sort of tax overhaul or health overhaul or anything else. Meanwhile, his daughter, Ivanka Trump, who is running her own little wing of the White House here, is reaching out to Democrats like John Larson on her idea of an expanded child tax credit, which seems to me to perhaps be the opposite of simplifying the tax code. But I guess I'm wondering what you see in that outreach from the first daughter.
Well, the child tax credit, it exists. So, expanding it doesn't necessarily make it more complicated. But I think that's an issue that conservatives and Democrats can get behind. And so I think that's an interesting issue for her to champion. She's wanted to find something to champion. I think it's actually a good issue for her to champion. And here's the thing. The Senate and Trump are not getting along. I think that's very clear. But, self-interest always comes into play when you're talking about any elected official. And at the end of the day, I think there's a self-interest on both sides to come up with something on tax reform. I did not see this same energy on a replacement with the health care because they just didn't have really something to coalesce behind. But on the tax issue, I'm seeing more coalescence behind on the tax issue than I did on health care.
I can't really remember which Republican said this. I heard it on NPR, but I thought it was kind of funny. Basically, they couldn't get together on health care because that's not really our issue. We don't know how to talk about it. But taxes, we know how to talk about it, so at least we can have a conversation. Let's take a break. There's a little bit more to talk about on the national front and a lot to talk about at the state level as well. We're talking today with Suzanne Bates from the Yankee Institute for Public Policy, Keith Fana from the Connecticut Mirror, and our own Colin McEnroe. We're in the wheelhouse here on WNPR. This is The Wheelhouse, our weekly news roundtable, and I'm talking about the week's news today with Suzanne Bates, who's the policy director at the Yankee Institute for Public Policy, Keith Vanov, who's the budget guru at the Connecticut Mirror. You can read more of his stuff at ctmirror.org, and Colin McEnroe, the host of the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. What's up today on your show, Colin?
This is one of our periodic interrogations of religious faith. We're going to look at people who basically keep a foot in two different religious traditions. Probably the most common one is the Thomas Merton combo plate, which is Catholic and Buddhist, but there'll be some others represented too.
The combo plate, you can order it like that?
Yeah.
Does it come with a side?
Thomas Merton combo plate, yeah. Your choice is super salad.
I should also say we have this conversation about once a year, and I want to pass along my condolences to you. Once again, you were not chosen for a MacArthur Genius Grant, but a friend of ours, Tyshawn Sorey, a brilliant jazz drummer and composer based at Wesleyan University in Middletown, was considered a genius this year and got a grant. So congratulations to Tyshawn Sorey.
Yes, I mean, I've been encouraging people who call to donate to say, when they donate here, to say Colin McEnroe is a genius, just to make me feel better. I would also like to say that I have seen Annie Baker's play, The Flick. She won a Genius Grant, and it's an amazing, amazing play. She's a wonderful playwright. And, of course, we all love Rhiannon Giddens. So I feel I'm not as wounded. Also,
you feel okay about it?
$625,000 doesn't go as far as it used to.
Well, I'm also wondering if maybe, given some of the news of this week, if maybe the thing to do is just to have people take an IQ test, and maybe just to figure, one person calls somebody else a moron, and then you say, hey, let's just battle an IQ test. I know who's going to win.
Also, if I get a MacArthur Grant next year, give it to my LLC.
Did you guys read before we move on to some state issues? Keith, did you read the big piece on Rex Tillerson, the New Yorker? Some of the detail that's in there about the feud between President Trump, Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State, and also a little bit more that I didn't know about Rex Tillerson sort of as a person. It seems as though if we talked in the first segment about him needing to cultivate a real relationship with people in the Senate, he might need to cultivate a slightly better relationship with a person who's flying around the world doing his foreign policy if we're going to stay out of some of the trouble that we seem to be facing in parts of the world.
I'm sorry, I'm misinformed. I haven't read that. Everything you're saying makes perfect sense. I do want to say, just along the vein of bad relationships, I do believe Colin is a genius, but I also think he's short.
I can live with that.
I mean, do you make anything, Suzanne, of this feud between the president and his Secretary of State?
Well, I mean, I think Trump has feuded with several of his administration. I mean, this was the tricky thing. When he came in to power as president, a lot of the Republican establishment had already spoken out against him. And so, now here he is trying to pick a cabinet out of a group of people who trying to find people who hadn't criticized him openly was difficult. And so, now it seems like things have soured between him and the Secretary of State. So we'll see how long Tillerson lasts. I mean, I think Tillerson has good relationships with other people in the Trump administration, so he may last a little bit longer. But, ultimately, he's the president, and he gets to pick his cabinet. And so, I mean, if Tillerson hasn't been diplomatic enough to make his boss happy, maybe, that's a sign of his role as top diplomat.
I don't know how much esteem he holds diplomacy in necessarily. I don't know, Colin. I mean, it could just be that this is, as Suzanne said, another one of these feuds he's having with people inside his administration. We've seen a lot of high-profile people leaving. It's just Rex Tillerson seems like a different type of character, and he also has a different type of job, especially given some of the negotiations going on around the world, and most importantly, with what's happening in North Korea.
As Suzanne said, he's the president. He gets to pick his cabinet. I wish he would. There are 2 cabinet positions vacant right now, which is kind of unprecedented. I think particularly this early in the term, we have no Secretary of Homeland Security, and of course, with the departure of Dr. Price, we have no one running Health and Human Services. So, but I mean, even more alarmingly, I am less alarmed by the feud and more alarmed by the fact that, and even the American Enterprise Institute, I say this to placate Suzanne, says the State Department in particular is critically understaffed. These major positions, assistant secretaries of state, who have these key portfolios, they don't exist, or they're staffed by some, career foreign service person or something who's just in there as a stopgap. I mean, this is a scary thing. A lot of these jobs are the what could go wrong jobs. You look at an unfolding situation, whether it's in North Korea or in the Middle East or the Near East, and that person's job is to say, what could go wrong? What are the 5 things we need to identify here? And that person isn't in the job right now.
I don't know. So I did read the New Yorker profile, and one of the things that I took away from it was that, the State Department's a mess in terms of, senior level appointments, that there was a lot of bloat there, and that Tillerson's, desire to shrink that bureaucracy a little maybe isn't the worst thing in the world. And so, yes, I mean, of course there are key roles that need to be filled, and the Trump administration has had trouble filling some of those key roles, particularly, I mean, the foreign policy establishment is very liberal.
But I mean, these
right?
vacancies...
I mean, even the conservatives, I'm using air quotes here, are quite liberal, and so I think it's been hard for him to find people who like his vision and want to work with him.
But if that's your perception, then what's happening right now is the kind of people that a conservative might want to cut out of that process are in fact serving at higher levels right now because there's nobody occupying these critical positions. So in a way, if you really want to go out there and get people with conservative bona fides, you should be staffing those positions.
Sure.
Well, let's turn to something a little close to home. Suzanne mentioned bloat. I like the word.
Your transition.
We're trying to figure out what's happening with the Connecticut state budget. So we're lucky that Keith Phaneuf is here to help explain it to us. I mean, most importantly, sort of on the political side of things right now, Keith, explain where we are in negotiations between House and Senate leadership, between Democratic and Republican leadership. We knew that this was going to be a little bit different sort of session because we had the split Senate and the close House. But the fact of the matter is that we just keep seeing week after week nothing getting done. Are we closer?
Okay, can I just clarify first? Is bloat leading us to the budget or to me?
I did the transition poorly. I'm talking about the budget, Keith.
Okay.
You look trim.
My
fit,
bloat is not the issue, is what you're saying.
And you look great today. So
okay.
no, please, no.
Okay.
But speaking of the budget
Sure.
and speaking of what's happening at the Capitol right now.
I mean, at this point, it's kind of like, as you know, John, I'm always groping for another analogy. They're at a concert where all the seats are bad. So every so often they just get up and they change spots and move around. So we've had a situation where the parties tried to do a budget, basically competing budgets along partisan lines. We've had situations where they all sat down with Governor Malloy. Well, believe it or not, there are things that the Democratic and Republican legislative leaders have in common without the governor. And that's kind of like, let's do the budget without the parliamentarian in the room. Anytime you want to talk about something that's kind of fiscally, legally questionable, maybe a gimmick, well, if the governor's staff is in there, his secretary, budget secretary Ben Barnes can say, sorry, I understand your idea, but we really can't make $1 billion selling staplers on eBay, so thanks for the idea, it just doesn't work. Well, now the administration's not in the room. So the legislature sort of gets to throw out their ideas, and there's really not someone else to. I mean, they've got nonpartisan staff, but it's not the same because the legislature are their bosses. So right now, what they're doing is they're sort of working on a plan that they say they want to bring to the governor, and I think there is some concern on the part of the administration that it not only, I won't say will be riddled with gimmicks, but it could be plagued with some gimmicks, and they're particularly dangerous if they've got a bipartisan endorsement.
Give me a little a flavor of what sort of gimmicks we're talking about here.
Well, some of them were in the budget that the governor just vetoed. I'll give you one example that's a real concern. The Republicans had proposed increasing pension contributions from teachers. If you just stop the sentence there, you're fine. The problem is they want to take that $95 million, put it in the budget, and use it not to augment what the state's already contributing to the pension fund, but to supplant it. In other words, it's kind of like a tax increase on teachers. Well, the problem is we actually have legal obligations in our bond covenants that say when we borrowed money to shore up the pension fund almost a decade ago, that the state basically wouldn't reduce the amount it contributed to the pension fund. So now we've got concerns that, hey, if you do this, it's not about, is it wrong to tax teachers? The idea is, can you legally do it, or are we going to be in court?
Suzanne?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear that we need to have teachers increase their contributions into the pension funds, especially new hires. I mean, we're at a point where our pensions are blowing up our budget, and I think that's a place where Keith and I would agree. That and it's bad this year. I mean, it gets much worse.
The issue now, those pesky legal requirements just can't be blown off because people want to say, we really need to deal with. The bottom line is we promised. People who bought $2 billion worth of bonds, we're not going to reduce our contribution. That's the issue. And it's the point that Suzanne said is what everyone goes, but we should be able to. It would be great if we could. And I know Suzanne is not saying let's blow off the legal point. It just doesn't serve you when you're, 15 weeks into the fiscal year without a budget. At some point, that other woulda, coulda, shoulda needs to wait.
I was hoping that they would sort of just finish out this thing because most of my information about this just comes from reading Keith's articles right now. I mean, I guess my question would be, and we may not have time to answer it on this side of the break, is if in fact they craft something that is still unappealing to Malloy. I mean, there are still some budgets that Governor Malloy will veto again, right?
I think absolutely. And this is, once again, earning the genius tag on the part of Colin. If nothing else, if he gets a budget that he believes is, in actuality, $400 million out of balance, I think he'll veto it, even if he suspects they'll override him to make clear when when the budget hits the fan, the legislature will own this mess.
He's Bob Corker in this situation, right?
Right. Well, and I think the other thing that's interesting is, I mean, you hear the leaders saying this. Well, we're at the table, we're getting closer, but will my caucus follow suit? Will those 3 moderate Democrats follow suit? Will the Republicans follow suit? Even if they come to an agreement. I don't think any of that's clear this year.
No, the Republicans built a back door if the taxes are too high.
Well, what we're going to do is we're going to stake out that back door, try to figure out what's going on with the state budget with Keith Faniff from the Connecticut Mirror, Suzanne Bates from the Yankee Institute for Public Policy, and also our own Colin McEnroe. We'll be right back after this break. But during the meantime, why don't you listen to my colleagues, because they're going to tell you why and how you can support WNPR and all the great news and information that you hear every day on this radio station. Here they are. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. We're talking about the week's news today with Keith Faniff. He's our budget guru from the Connecticut Mirror, ctmirror.org. Suzanne Bates, who's policy director at the Yankee Institute for Public Policy, and our own Colin McEnroe. You can join us at 860-275-7266, talking a bit about state government and the lack of a state budget. Let's go quickly to Bill, who's calling from Windsor. Hey, Bill, go ahead.
Yes, I read Keith's articles all the time and try to keep up on Suzanne's articles also. I have a question. I hear Governor Malloy all the time saying we're going to have an open and honest discussion. When are we going to have an open and honest discussion about total compensation for state employees? I mean, it's not just the salary, it's the health care, it's the holidays, it's the vacations, it's the cost of living, all those things that you call fringe benefits. I read in an article, one of you guys' articles, that said that teachers, retirement, they get 27 cents of fringe benefits to every dollar. The prison guards get 80 cents to every dollar, and the police. And then the highest one, I guess, is UConn and the judicial system. That's about 83 cents of every dollar goes to fringe benefits. So I'm asking you guys to see if you can do articles, get on the microphones and start talking about this, because the optics are bad when you read in the paper that Governor Malloy has signed a CBAC agreement that gives 60% of now overtime to be added to their pensions at the prisons, which is basically the whole thing of pension padding.
Well,
it needs to be discussed.
Well, and let's discuss it right now. Bill, thanks very much for that. We were discussing some of this while we were not on the air, just for a few minutes. So,
Mom and Dad were fighting.
Why don't you, Keith? Why don't you respond to Bill a little bit, and let's get into this conversation.
Okay, I got to clarify something though first, because this is probably one of the most misrepresented numbers. When he said that 80 or 83 cents that certain employees are receiving benefits equal to 83 or 80% of their salaries. That is not accurate. What the state does is it takes a look at what is the existing payroll, what is the existing amount that we have to spend on benefits. Not just benefits, setting aside the money for current employees. What's all the money we have to make up for the past? And they simply compare that and create a ratio. But that does not mean existing state employees are earning a pension equal to 83% of their salary. About a little more than 84% of all the money right now that's going into the pension fund is making up for the sins of the past, the unfunded liability. So that, though, it confuses, it distorts it. It makes it sound like present-day workers are getting all of this, and most of this is dealing with covering the money that wasn't set aside in the past and all the investment earnings.
So, go ahead.
But part of the problem is that we've consistently undervalued the cost of those fringe benefits. So even for current pensions, right, the way we measure, I mean, actuaries come up with these numbers. They measure how much it's going to cost us in the future to provide these benefits. And we've consistently undervalued how much they cost. They're actually much more expensive. So, I mean, everyone likes to say our pension problem is just because we haven't set aside enough money. That's really only half the problem. The other half is that we really didn't want to recognize how expensive those benefits were. And so the cost of those benefits are growing, so much faster than every other part of the budget. And it was Bill that called. I mean, he's exactly right in terms of the compensation in Connecticut. When you compare us, the public and the private sector, the public sector is much higher. And then when you compare us to other states, we're also much higher. Our average state employee in Connecticut makes $10,000 more than the average state employee in Massachusetts. That's using census figures. I'm happy to share those numbers with anybody that wants to see them. It's at $5,000 more than the average state employee in New York. That adds up to a lot of extra money.
But let's get down to how we solve this problem, because we have some of the same conversations. I think Bill calls. You certainly call for a serious conversation about how we address this problem long term. But we do have contracts in place right now about the pension system that we have. And maybe, Keith, just start with you. Just explain exactly what can be and what cannot be done legally in your mind right now to change any of the things that maybe are spiking the budget costs and causing the problem.
I will, but I want to clarify something, though. It doesn't solve the problem to try to characterize the unfunded liability, which, by the way, includes the amount we didn't invest. We talk about what's undervaluing things. The unfunded liability has both. It has the money we didn't set aside as well as the value of those pensions. And don't underestimate the compounding factor, because that is by far the single biggest factor, not the generosity of the pensions. But more important, it does not help the debate when that problem is mischaracterized as simply the cost of providing benefits to present-day workers. There's no way inaccuracy ever helps the debate, Suzanne. That, to me, is the biggest problem with that. As far as what we can or cannot do, there is a real debate going on at the Capitol because the concessions deal that the governor struck, that was ratified both by the unions and the legislature, does have language that says for the life of that agreement, the state is going to pledge to make all changes at the bargaining table. And there's a question of, can we right now say, well, actually, we're going to make some changes unilaterally. We'll do it now. But they don't kick in until after 2027. But we're going to take the savings now in the budget and see if that will hold up in court. The governor says it won't. I don't think the fact that the unions are going to sue is the answer, because, I mean, yes, they'll sue probably no matter what. But when you're taking the savings in the current budget, it's kind of hard to make the argument that this is just a prospective action, because it's going to affect the money that's saved for workers affected by that agreement.
So the question is, can we, starting in 2027, set benefits, our pension benefits, through statute instead of through collective bargaining? 46 other states set their pension benefits through statute.
The question is, when can you do that?
Right. When can you do that? And as of 2027, the Republicans, and I think they're right, are arguing that they can set their pension benefits through statute instead of through collective.
But can they do it now?
Yeah, I believe they can. You believe they can't.
No,
Look,
I think it's unclear.
This question would clearly end up in court. So But the problem is what do we do, right? And I agree with you that it's not current workers, it's past, I mean, look, the pension problem is the pension problem. It's a huge, huge problem, and it's dragging the whole state down.
John, just quickly, Suzanne knows it's not a no harm, no foul situation if you lose in court. It's not like, well, we took our shot and there was no. You're going to actually have to not just probably pay a penalty. You're going to have to make up, if it goes an actuarial cycle down the road, all the investment money you didn't gain.
Here's what I'm seeing.
It's a big gamble financially.
I see what you're saying, Keith, but I'm also seeing other states like Rhode Island where the unions take them to court for the changes they make, and then they end up doing better,
that's
better
totally
off than
different.
they were.
They promised nothing contractually in Rhode Island.
Every state is different.
Well, every state
but
is
I
different.
think we have to try something, because either way, we're getting dragged down by this problem. And if we don't do something, doing nothing, I think, is the worst option at this point.
I would just like to say to Bill that at least since 2014, I have been suggesting that I know nothing sounds more empty than a blue ribbon panel, but I really do think there needs to be a blue ribbon panel, a nonpartisan or bipartisan panel on exactly the stuff that Suzanne is talking about and the stuff that Bill's talking about. What is the nature of state employee compensation in Connecticut? How does it compare to relevant parts of the private sector and to comparable pay schedules in states ideally as much like ours as possible? I think when Suzanne says something like that, whether it's true or not, there's a number of people who will discount it or say, well, she's with the Yankee Institute. So let's get a bunch of numbers that we can agree on. And also, in the course of doing that, really acknowledge some of the things that are currently part of the agreement that are crazy. Now, whether we have the mechanism to change those things or not is a separate conversation. But I think there are still, Keith, there's still people who get longevity pay, right? Longevity bonuses?
And the last
which is crazy.
Concessions agreement was supposed to get rid of it, but what they did was they basically grandfathered it in with one more payment. So you've sort of got that longevity. It's just by a different name, but it's still
longevity
baked into
bonuses,
the pay.
just for people who are listening, they're basically you're still breathing, you haven't done anything in particular, but here's some extra money.
I want to go to one more phone call on this. Jennifer's in Hartford. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. What's on your mind?
I have a question. The teachers that work in the state of Connecticut don't have Social Security. That's not part of their pay or, receiving benefits later on when they retire. Has that been brought up to change that? Because most state employees will also receive Social Security when they retire.
Keith, thanks for the question, Jennifer.
They don't get it, but I have to say that's one of the places where people lose perspective. One, of course, the teachers don't pay into Social Security, but much more important than that, they get a far more generous benefit. If you look at the Nonpartisan Office of Fiscal Analysis, they reported the average pension awarded to a Connecticut teacher last year, regular retirement, not someone who retired early, was $59,700. If you then take the average Social Security benefit, $17,700. That's like saying a $42,000 pension and $17,700 in Social Security, or yes, they don't get Social Security, but they get something far superior. They didn't have to pay into Social Security, and 25% of their pension is exempt from state income tax.
Well, here's the problem, though. I think the problem comes in for teachers who don't fully vest in the pension system. So if you're a teacher and you only work for 10 years in Connecticut, your retirement savings are almost non-existent. You get the money back that you put into the pension system, but you don't get any interest on that. You just very little anyway. So the pension system as it's currently constituted is really not helping the majority of teachers. It's helping about half who stay in for the full length of time, the 35 years. So we do need to work on teacher pensions. But the problem is, and I think Keith would agree with me on this, that the covenant that we made with bondholders when we took out a $2 billion bond to put into the teacher pension system makes it much more difficult to reform the teacher pension system. So we need to see reform of the teacher pension system. We need to figure out what we can do. And this is where I don't know if I'm calling for another blue ribbon commission, but we need to sit down and figure out how to reform that pension system so it works for more teachers and also so that it's not bankrupting the state and that we can do based on those bond covenants. So it's a tricky problem.
Speaking of teachers and paying for education, the Connecticut State Supreme Court this week agreed to hear challenges to a controversial order calling for sweeping changes to the way the state teaches children and pays for education. So once again, we're back in court with this CCJEF lawsuit. That's the Connecticut Coalition for Justice and Education Funding, Suzanne. And now we're going to see whether or not this very wide ruling that was going to overhaul the way we pay for education, whether or not this stands.
Right. I mean, Judge Mukasher, who was the lower court who ruled on this, he said, that we're spending enough on education, we're just not spending it in a smart way. That the education cost sharing grant which is, the grant that they use to fund all the towns, that they're not even using it. They're not using it in a consistent way. So, I was really hoping that the legislature was going to do something on the ECS formula this session. They still may in the final budget. They need to make sure they're spending the money in a rational way. And I think there are a lot of good ideas about how to do that. But we're spending, I think we're the fourth highest right now in the nation in terms of how much money we're spending per child. It's $18,000 per child, according to the National Center for Education Statistics. So that's a lot of money. So if we're not helping every child, why not, right? That's the question.
Can I just ask a quick? What should the number be?
What should the number be?
What should the number be? How much should you spend per child to educate kids?
Well, how much? Are you? The question isn't a number. The question is, are you spending it rationally? Are you helping child in an
No,
I
know, but
way?
since you boil it down to a number, and I'm just wondering, what is the formula? What's the amount of money we should be spending per child to educate kids in Connecticut?
We should be spending enough to make sure that they're getting an adequate education, and the money that we're spending. It's not even the number that's a concern to me. It's that for example, they're spending $24,000 per child in Hartford, which is a significant amount of money. Yet you read about them not having paper in classrooms.
I want to turn to Keith quickly.
Where's the money going?
Very quickly, I'm not trying to torture Suzanne, but there's one thing that's not correct. The judge did not say we're spending enough. He did not say we're spending too little. He went out of his way to say, I'm not commenting on whether we spend enough or not. He said we spend it irrationally. He did say the amount we need to spend may very well vary child per child based on their needs, but that's for the legislature to decide.
A last thought on this, Colin?
A lot of homework for the state Supreme Court, which is the most underreported on institution in Connecticut. I believe we just added 2 Supreme Court justices while I was on vacation. This is one of these very messy decisions. The McCosher decision decides for the plaintiffs but gives them things they never asked for and don't want. The court will be multiply briefed on this in a very, very messy and complicated way. They've taken it with all due expedition, skipping appellate courts, going direct from Superior to Supreme. But this is going to be a very tough decision to make.
Messy once again this week in the news with Colin McEnroe, the host of the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks to Keith Pfand of Budget Guru at the Connecticut Mirror, ctmirror.org. Thanks, Keith.
Thank you.
Thanks also to Suzanne Bates, Policy Director at the Yankee Institute for Public Policy. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thanks for having me.
Our technical producer is Kyone Wolf. Our digital editor, our executive producer, is Katie Tolarski. Join us at WNPR.org/The Wheelhouse. Here are some friends to tell you how you can support everything that we do here on WNPR.